Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Today, a view from across the pond. I used to travel to Britain, to the UK really frequently for work, and I was at one point married to a Brit, so we traveled a lot to see family, but I hadn't been in a long while until June when I went to attend the wedding of my godson. We stayed in a pretty posh part of town and it was all nice and it was clean and it was calm and the wedding celebrations were great. But then I'd go back to my hotel room at night and I'd turn on the news and I would see crisis and chaos and protests and crime and fear on the streets. So what was I seeing? The issues were still the same: a new government in some trouble, Brexit, immigration. So what is going on in the UK? What does it mean for us when our Prime Minister says we are the most European of the non-European countries? So we are going to speak to a Canadian who now lives in London. Andrew MacDougall used to be Director of Communications for Prime Minister Harper. Now he's a partner at Trafalgar Communications, a strategic consulting and communications firm. Welcome. How are you?
Doing very well. Thank you for having me on.
No, it's great. So, what London should I have been seeing? The one on Piccadilly with great restaurants and clean streets, or the one I saw on the news at night? What's going on?
Yeah, I think the answer, Senator, is both. I think really London, the challenge when you look at the United Kingdom or in England specifically, is that London is very much not like the rest of the country.
Yeah.
It exerts a pull over the rest of the country that it's hard, I think, for Canadians to understand. You not only have the center of government, Westminster's in London, you have business that's also based in London, and you have the arts. Basically,
Yeah.
London has everything, whereas in Canada, you might split those things between Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary. It's all in London, and that
And the
creates
states where you'd have New York and Washington, yeah.
absolutely. And so I think what you see is a London where university educated service professionals like myself are doing very well and thriving and love the city and all it has to offer. And then I think you have the other side of society that services people like us, who work in the restaurants and pubs or in the theaters to the plays we go see. And they're finding it a bit tougher. The cost of living in London is quite high. As you noted in the intro, immigration has been an issue here, God, for at least 10, 12, 15 years. And
Yeah.
the numbers and the sheer number of people that are coming, both through legal channels and irregular channels across the channel, is quite striking. And the British public is essentially telling its government that it is tired of this and it needs someone to get a grip. And Keir Starmer has been in office for just over a year now and has
Yeah.
manifestly failed to get a grip on any of it. And I think you're seeing a lot of that failed promise now coming back to bite.
These protests by mothers in cities across the UK of illegals, of immigrants, attacking children, and it's very reminiscent of what we're hearing and seeing in the US. This has really become a fight about particularly the illegals who are there. And the ones that are committing crime, that's become the focal point on the quote immigration question.
Yeah, and certainly what you've seen here, Senator, is that the government has chosen to put a lot of these people who are arriving into hotels. Obviously, the pandemic knocked the stuffing out of the hospitality industry. And so in that lull in their accounts, they decided to open themselves up to house people who are coming into the country. And so you do get these situations where you have kind of significant concentrations of people from very different cultures now put into places, smaller communities in Essex or even downtown London. And these have been the scenes of protests since last summer. We had a period of riot after the tragic murder of three young girls, and in Stockport, and you saw and kind of spilling out across the country of that. And that is again the thing that's manifesting across the country. And I think there's been a 40-year or longer conversation about the benefits of immigration, and that was predicated on a certain level of immigration, certainly not the levels of immigration countries like the United Kingdom or Canada are seeing now. And people, and this was our experience in government, was that people will support the immigration system as long as they feel it's being managed and that the government's in control and taking strong, clear decisions on who comes in on what criteria.
And the people aren't jumping the queue. This
Yeah.
is, in fairness, does actually seem to be at the heart of this, which is a good thing.
Yeah, it is. And I think people lose sight, Senator, of the sheer number. If you look, the Sunday Times columnist, Matthew Syed, had a piece this weekend where he laid out the numbers, and they were very small in terms of immigration into the United Kingdom throughout the 80s and 90s. 80s was a lot of exodus from the country when the 70s had been quite grim and people decided to leave. But then as the Big Bang, Thatcher's Big Bang settled in and economic prosperity came back to Britain, you had and then the joining of the EU and knitting together of the EU and Tony Blair's decision to not limit essentially the number of incoming people from the new EU countries. And so you suddenly had immigration shoot up to hundreds of thousands a year. And ever since, you've had politicians promising to wind that back. David Cameron, very famously, who said, we'll limit it to the tens of thousands. And, in the last year of the Conservative administration that just left, there was almost a million
Yeah,
people that came through. And you can only look down your nose at the population for so long going, what are you worried about? Aren't you all just a little bit racist? When the absolute number of people coming in is an order of magnitude greater than it was. And the government hasn't shown any sense that it can manage that in a proper way while still provisioning resources like schooling, healthcare, police,
exactly.
public
Housing.
safety.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly it. When it's where the rubber hits the road. When your kids don't have a chair in the classroom or you're in a hallway in a hospital, you go, okay, what's going on here, right? We've got a deal. I want to get into a little bit about because there's been a few pieces that I've read recently about Mark Carney better take a page or two from Keir Starmer here because he's only a year in and the numbers have crashed on some of the issues. We're talking about this, diversifying our trade and breaking with the US and all of that. We can't break up with the US. We do $900 billion worth of joint trade every year, and it seems in the sense Britain can't break up with Europe either. I mean, it's pretty hard to diversify markets when they're right there, when you're joined at the hip. So, what lessons are there from what Keir Starmer has gone through in the fall from grace in the last year?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson is you better get something done. I think, I think people accept that the world has dealt countries like Canada and the UK a difficult set of issues over the last year. There's a lot of bills that have been coming due that series of governments didn't address. And so I think, if you're elected into this environment, you have a very long to-do list and not a lot of public tolerance and patience to get things done. And I think you have to be as clear as you can about what you're going to do and then do it. I think that is the one thing, regardless of what you do. I
Yeah.
think people are just tired of seeing this crank get turned and nothing happening, or nothing happening for them and their lives are getting worse. And I think, you should never overinterpret your mandate. I think Keir Starmer won a mandate that was impressive when you looked at seat count. It wasn't impressive when you looked at the percentage of the vote, which was in the mid 30s, mid to low 30s, and the margins were quite small in a lot of those constituencies. And similarly for Carney, I think he
Hmm.
benefited from not being Donald Trump. Let's face it, the Liberals were on track to be hammered.
Yeah.
Justin Trudeau leaving made some people come home. Donald Trump kind of going into full psychopath mode
Well,
scared a lot of people.
51st state is like a trigger here. And I mean, there's no question it changed the election for many.
Yeah, and Mark Carney's just, I think Mark Carney is a man that's used to people thinking quite highly of him, and I think he's quite confident in his own ability. I think that's easier to express action when you're a central bank governor than when you're the elected leader and a prime minister. You have to have a team to get things done. You don't control all the issues. You
Yeah.
don't, you don't have the authority you do in that kind of narrow role as a bank governor. And I think he's got to adapt to that reality where him snapping his fingers or barking an order might not get the job done, and it takes sustained follow through. And this is where he's, I think, a bit hamstrung by the way Justin Trudeau left the party. He didn't leave a lot of time to draw in new blood for Carney to get his people to have his own vision, his own policy platform. So he's kind of in office with a platform that may or may not be what he wanted against an issue set that he certainly probably didn't want or didn't dream of, but is. And on the other side of that is a mercurial, temperamental, inconsistent, illiterate, economic wise, U.S. president. And as you said, we as Canada put a tremendous number of eggs in that basket, because why wouldn't you when you have the world's longest undefended border, the best two-way trading relationship in the history of the earth? And no one likes to contemplate the scenario. What if we woke up one morning and they were the enemy? It's not a
Mhm.
problem you can solve quickly, which is a problem for Carney. He needs to solve things quickly. This isn't one of them.
Well, this is the issue about, the Brexit question, which is, and I guess this is my issue with the reaction, or in my mind, the overreaction to the 51st state. I mean, when Justin Trudeau uttered that phrase, I think Trump just went, oh, okay, that's a button I can press. Let's just go for that. And Canadians did the, requisite elbows up and all the rest. But it's a mile wide, but it's an inch deep. Because when things start to actually impact fiscally, economically for people at home, then you start to say, oh, well, maybe these counter tariffs are actually hurting us too and putting the cost up. And now I can't get as many American goods as I thought I could at the store. Like we're starting, I think, to enter a little bit of that phase of, what the cost of elbows up is, or walking away from the US.
Yeah, and again, you should never overplay your hand in any negotiation. You should certainly never overplay it when you're the weaker party in
Yeah.
that negotiation. And yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of, if you look at Canada's fiscal position, it's not great anyway, because Justin Trudeau and the last government spent a lot of money. And sure, there was the pandemic, but there was a lot of spending before, there was a lot of spending after. And so the fiscal position was always going to be tough. It was always going to take some sacrifice to get our books back into balance. But at the same time, you have a population that is clearly wanting more from their government. They can't get on the housing ladder. They don't feel safe.
Mm.
The cost of living hitting them in their pocketbook. So that requires government action. And then, if you do not renegotiate your largest two-way trading relationship in the world in a way that's good for the country, that fiscal position is going to take another hit. And I think, if you look at some of the commentary that's around, I think people realize that Carney's been put in a tough position. But as you say, he hasn't helped himself by being politically expedient during the campaign and
Yeah.
playing into the, oh yeah, I'm going to be the big tough man and go in there and tell him what and what for. Well, yeah, good luck. The mouse doesn't go up and do that.
But we're also kind of last at the table. I mean, we saw the Brits sign a deal, and then the UK, the EU deal was kind of staggering. I mean, they agreed to buy $750 billion worth of energy, which, yes, some of it we're through the back door supplying to the US, but at a discount. We're selling cheap energy into the US. Now they're going to have this deal with the Europeans, and we're still trying to get a phone call answered here. So it seems we've put ourselves in a bit of a corner.
Yeah, and again, this gets back to what cards you have in your hand when you're doing this. In the EU, love them or hate them, on digital policy and technology, they have a
Yeah.
kind of regulatory superstate. And if you're looking at the kind of ultimate weapon in that, if the US wants to play silly buggers on trade and goods, the EU can turn around, okay, let's do services now.
Yeah.
And the conversation becomes a lot more difficult. Canada doesn't have that whip hand with the states. What we have is a deeply integrated supply chain. But of course, Donald Trump wants to repatriate as much of that as he
Yeah.
can. And as we witnessed when I was in government with Prime Minister Harper during the financial crisis, we were very close to losing the auto industry, and Obama going in and subsidizing the auto industry is not something
Mhm.
Stephen Harper ever wanted to do. But when the choice is don't do it and the industry sneaks across the border, then what do you say to Canadians who work in those sectors? So, as ever, politics is a series of ugly choices,
Yeah.
and Canada just doesn't have a lot of levers. And I
Well,
don't
and
think
the
that would change it with a different prime minister. But the tone and attitude and approach and strategic approach maybe ought to have been different.
But we do, and we're having this discussion about the auto sector, and it's been alive in the last couple of days, and the softwood lumber question. But we're sitting there on the most precious set of resources in the world: oil, gas, critical minerals, uranium, potash, the whole nine yards. And as you say, there's been no actual activity to monetize that in some new or different way. Like we can build a pipeline, but if we've got nothing coming out of the ground to put in the pipeline, and the government gave itself extraordinary powers with C5 to actually make decisions and move forward, and we're still kind of in a holding pattern. Is that fair? It's only 3 months in or 4 months in at this point, or is he starting to hit the time frame here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the 100 days is the natural point where you first take stock and go, okay, how are we doing here? And I think it's
Yeah.
been an extraordinary period. But I think this is where what we were talking about before comes to bite. When Carney himself, the man, is obviously intelligent and has had an impressive career, he doesn't have an apparatus around him. I don't even think the government's not really fully staffed. There hasn't been this great incoming influx of brains and heft to kind of help. You keep hearing that Michael Sabia is going to shuffle the deck in the public service to get the kind of best performers and the best places, but that takes time and ultimately doesn't move the dial. And I think this is the thing that Carney will figure out is that it's not up to him alone. And I think
Hmm.
the sooner he does that and empowers people, but then you run into the problem of who in that cabinet would you give unfettered
More power
access?
to, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's not to slight the people in cabinet. I mean, you kind of have to work with who's elected. But a proper transition between governments would have given a chance for more people to be elected, and that's just hard. But Carney wanted the job. He won the
Yep.
job. He's going to have to deal with
Do the job,
his
yeah.
ratings.
I think the other thing that sort of concerns, I mean, I come to this discussion always with a Western vantage point, which is the group around him, his key advisors now are all the guys from Quebec, right? So again, that doesn't change much of the focus on energy, oil and gas, even the environmental issues. It's still skewed that other way. Call it whatever you will, the Laurentian elites, or all of that stuff. But it doesn't feel like it's changing.
No, and I think, Senator, if you look back to who Mark Carney is, and this is the case Pierre Poilievre was trying to make, is that he is that I don't want to say Davos man because that's a bit conspiratorial, but he is a pro
Oh,
globalization, pro free
yeah.
markets, pro environment and environmental regulation. That's when he left the Bank of England, that's what he put all his chips into green business and greening the economy and leading those finance groups. And for him to come in and kind of bin off the carbon tax and go, haha, look how decisive I am. It just makes me wonder, what do you really believe in anything that you've been talking about? And I think in as much as what Mark Carney believes, it is not, as you say, pro resource extraction, et cetera, all playing to Canada and Western Canada's strengths in particular. So I
Mhm.
think it is an uphill battle. It is one where I think he's trying to say the right things to constituencies west of Ontario, but how much there is actually going to be there when the time comes. If Wab Kinew or somebody objects to some piece of critical infrastructure, or if Alberta gets a bit ropey and continues down the path of separation, or if BC decides that they don't want to play ball, like what kind of leverage will he have over his own federation? And this is Canada's strength and its weakness, is
That's
that
right. Yeah.
there are multiple partners you have to bring on board to do that, whether that's provincial premiers, Indigenous communities. And again, all to the point, there's not just a lever that Mark Carney sits with in the Prime Minister's office and pulls it and things happen. Whereas if he changes the interest rates, markets move, things happen, money supply tightens, expands. It's a more direct feedback loop.
The Davos man and the banker, those are they're still very powerful images. There have been former UK leaders like Liz Truss, even though she was, I think, PM for 15 minutes, but whatever, saying his reputation wasn't that great as the central banker. He involved himself in politics on the Brexit issue, etc. And then, as you say, went on to write the script for the net zero economy, including restricting financial institutions from investing in more traditional forms of energy, etc. So there are mixed messages. What is the take in the UK? Like that perspective, is Liz Truss on the money or is she a one-off?
Well, I think, Senator, it's a common complaint from conservative politicians that Mark Carney was too much of a politician, and I think that's a fair criticism. I think, and even when he was the Bank of Canada governor, I can remember a few pointed conversations, and this came up a bit during the campaign between Flaherty,
Mhm.
Harper, and Carney, who takes credit for what, and the prime minister was very kind of strict on this is mine, the fiscal, the monetary is yours. I will
Right.
not kind of play in your pond, you don't play in mine. And I also remember Mark Carney kind of assiduously courting the journalists in Ottawa. You could often find him, sitting around with your Evan Solomons, who like is in
Yeah.
cabinet now, and John Iveson, and that's good journalism. You should be trying to talk to these people. I don't want to cast aspersions on that, but he did play a more political game than someone who was, set on a career in central banking, was never ever had a thought of coming over to the. He always had a thought of coming to the political side, and that's what we're seeing now. And so I think it is fair for conservatives in the UK to say, he did do monger a bit about Brexit. In the immediate term, yes, things weren't as bad in terms of markets, etc. Certainly, what Liz Truss did to the UK economy with her
Yeah.
budget was worse. But
Yeah.
over the long run, Brexit has not been a great thing for the United Kingdom. Per our earlier conversation, you just can't make up that deficit in trade with the EU. So he wasn't wrong there. I
Oh,
guess
yeah.
over the
No,
long run, we're all proven right, maybe, but he certainly did. He didn't shy away from opining on whether that's kind of Scottish referendum impacts on that, Brexit impacts on the country. And I think that's central bank governors are thrust into this. You see Trump trying to do this with Jerome Powell every
yeah.
single waking second of the day, trying to stick him into the political fire.
Yeah. A couple of other things. This decision by the UK, by Britain, by Starmer and France and Canada to seemingly out of nowhere, the timing was a bit odd to say we're going to recognize a Palestinian state come the fall. What was the motivation there? Is this, lots of people say, look, the population, the construct of the population is changing. We've seen what's been happening on the streets with the protests in Europe and certainly in Canada on the university campuses. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think there is, and you saw this in the election that the UK had in the summer of 2024 that saw Keir Starmer come to power. Is you saw quite a number of high-profile Labour MPs either be defeated by single issue candidates on the question of Gaza in Israel. And you had a number of cabinet ministers thinking people like West Streeting, the health secretary, who almost lost his seat, only won by 500 votes in
Hmm.
East London, which was a readout of British Labour support. So there is a very real phenomenon on the left, I think, in Britain, in France, in Canada, that see this issue as the issue, and they make their votes based on how their politicians think about this. And I think the Liberal Party in Canada has always been very attuned to cultural communities, immigrant communities, and making sure they can count on their vote. And I think there are far more votes in supporting the Palestinians
The
than there is
Muslim
in
communities
defending
as
the
opposed to the, yeah.
Jewish state. And I think Keir Starmer, I think I think there's a tension in him because he is a lawyer by trade. He sees things through a very legal point of frame, but the people around him obviously have to be quite political. And the big story here in Britain is the tension between the political and the more lawyerly side of Starmer's personality. And I think that's why you saw this hiccup. He's getting pressure. There's over 100 MPs that want statehood recognized for the Palestinian people, and that we've had nearly 2 years now of war in Gaza, and I think that you can have a range of opinions about how that conduct of that campaign has been and who's to blame and what it takes to end it. But I think a lot of people are just you can't help but be horrified when you look at what Gaza has become. And even if you think Hamas are the worst people on earth, which they are, and they were the ones that started this, and they were the ones that could end it if they released the hostages, put down their weapons, and just promise not to kill Jews. That's what it takes.
Or their own people, frankly, by denying them food or putting military installations in their living room.
Yeah, look, wouldn't it be nice, Senator, if Hamas would just come out in the open with their guns and weapons and fight the Israelis?
Yeah.
head to head, but they can't do that. Of course, they hide behind in hospitals, they hide behind teachers, they hide behind schools, they hide amongst the population. And they know that if ordinary Palestinians get hurt in the middle of that the world will blame Israel. And you can argue that Israel ought to know that and therefore ought to conduct their campaign knowing that any retribution will be portrayed in that light. But, then again, 1,200 people murdered in cold blood and hundreds
Yep.
taken into the tunnels. Like if it were an easy issue to solve, we'd have solved it already. And I think Western politicians are very aware of a very restive part of the population that does go out and demonstrate, even if they do horrible things like threaten Jewish schools or businesses, as you've seen in Canada and here, and the moral inversion in the West, like that's a bigger subject. We used to see things a bit more clearly than that, and we can't ever reward terror and should never reward terror. But yeah,
It comes into the free speech issue and the regulation of the internet, which I want to get to in 1 minute. But just this whole question, the timing. I mean, certainly for Prime Minister Carney, he's in the middle of a stalemate with the U.S. in a sense in this 24-hour period. Who knows what'll happen tomorrow? So this was a diversion in many ways. It certainly changed some of the discussion. But for these three leaders to choose to do this when the conditions that they have laid down are unmeetable in terms of, this decision they'll make by the UN gathering in the fall. So on the one hand, they're going to risk having to go ahead with this decision to recognize a Palestinian state, even though the conditions aren't met, or walk away from, it seems like a no-win move, and nobody's having an election tomorrow morning. So why the timing on this? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the issue that comes in their inboxes.
Yeah,
You'll have the same in your
yeah,
job, and your colleagues will have the same. It is the vocal minority that is in their inboxes saying this is a real problem. You have to sort it. And I think, I think we're not in a place anymore where people think through the logical conclusions of their actions because everything has become a race of tactics and not strategy. And okay, say you were to say this is a state now. Who governs it?
yeah.
They can't even answer that basic question. Certainly not Gaza, or not Hamas in Gaza. They don't have any right. And the Palestinian Authority, okay, well, Mahmoud Abbas has not got the job done for how long now? Do Palestinians even trust him? Who do Palestinians trust enough to govern them? And is there one Palestinian, or is it Gaza and the West Bank? And these are all fiendishly complicated questions that nobody wants to answer. They want to do the easy thing
Right.
so they can
Just make a
hashtag it and
statement
say,
and
we've done that. And look, we're on the right side of this issue, quote unquote.
yeah, if indeed they are. All right. So on this whole question, because the actions of the Hamas supporters, of the Palestinian supporters, we've seen them pouring out on the streets, saying regularly and clearly and in front of television screens, "Let's kill all Jews, death to all Jews." And on the other hand, we see Western nations overreacting to other. I don't know if you're aware of it, but there was some, American Christian singer pro MAGA that wanted to sing in Canada, and we ended up making him a cause celeb because we wouldn't let him perform a song. And I think ordinary people are going, how can you chant on the street "death to all Jews," but if you want to sing a song with Christian MAGA references in it, you're going to be banned. Like, have we kind of lost the plot here?
Well, yeah, I think the short answer is yes, and I think this is one where look, when you started your career in the media, God, what a different landscape it was,
No
right? You had
kidding.
very few people that had access to the megaphone, and to get that access, to lend your platform to someone, you would go to someone based on their expertise, their ability to contribute to a debate. Now, what we've done is democratize both the production and the distribution of information. And that, in theory, can be a good thing. But what you quickly find out is that most people don't know a lot about most things, but that doesn't keep them away from expressing an opinion or thinking that their opinion about a pandemic, a war, a cause is as valid as someone who has spent their lives studying this. And that's not to say you can't have an informed amateur, But I think when you platform these things or put them on platforms like the major social media platforms of the attention economy that run on algorithmic AI, like emotional response, you do get this majoring of issues that are quite minor in daily life. So if you think back to the
A good
trans,
way to put it. Yeah,
think back to Gaza, you get these issues that get confected and whipped into things that people feel they should address. And then I think you get the second order outputs like the things you're describing, where suddenly we're having these, who cares what this guy's singing? And it was
exactly.
like, like, are you going to go back to the 70s? And, I know Richard Pryor, oh, he was controversial. Should we like,
Right.
you let them sing, hate
Yeah,
speech is hate speech. It's criminalized for a reason. You cannot go out on the street and call for the death of any people.
yeah,
That's a crime. And when you don't enforce it, then others become emboldened. And you can't not enforce things for fear of what those people will say about you, whether that's calling you a racist. Like, point to the law book. Can you do this? Yes or no?
yeah.
And I expect if I were to go on the street and ask for the death of a class of people, that I would be dealt with quite severely, even if people think I'm on the right side of that issue. The law is the law. And when it
The
ceases to be the law, then we run into trouble. Then we get a lot of angry people in the street going, why is it one rule for some people and another
right.
rule for others? That's anathema to our way of life and our system of government, or at least it used to be.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, I'm a free speecher, and that should be the right to say things that offend you, but I can't be hateful, and I certainly can't threaten death. All of those things. But we've seen governments in the West now increasingly, in response to the stuff that we see on social media, and it's not a pretty world. It certainly isn't, and there are a lot of idiots expressing opinions and thoughts about which they know nothing. But has the response been too dramatic the other way? We've got several pieces of legislation here. The Online Act. The Brits are doing the same thing, trying to control what's on the internet. They're having the discussion about age gating, rules about, how old you have to be. They too want 16-year-olds to vote. We're having that same crazy discussion here. Um, and we've got a piece of legislation that we'll be dealing with in the fall, C2, which is again designed to allow governments backdoors into people's internet lives. And we understand circumstances where that may be useful, but it also makes people very, very nervous to have Big Brother looking at what goes on in our email discussions with friends and family.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is one where if you look at the laws, codes that have governed speech in the advanced Western democracies, they were built for an analog age. In the digital age, it's the speed and scale and reach of these platforms that's the problem. So I happen to have just written a policy paper for the Macdonald Laurier Institute on this question of what do you do about this? And it's fiendishly complicated,
Yeah,
as you might expect. And I think what we see now is free speech has been accompanied by free reach. And that's not an enumerated right. Say what you want, but the second a platform that has access to half the world decides that what you have to say is engaging for their user base, and they ship it around the world, that's a different conversation. And I think it's not one that broadcasters or publishers, they've never had that ability. They are liable for what they put on their broadcasts or in their papers. We don't have that with the internet because we wanted to encourage it to grow. And so I think what you're seeing is we're all trying to catch up to things we should have been doing 20 years ago when these platforms were coming around. And now they're trying to fix the wrong end of the problem center. They're trying to fix the output. And the
yeah,
output of these platforms is enormous. You cannot do it at scale. You cannot do it with
right.
the AI. You see Meta, whoever, fail all the time to get sexually abusive material, chapter and verse of nasty content, suicide, encouraging,
Yeah,
extortion, drug deal. Like, all this stuff happens on these platforms. And that's why you have to go back to the business model. In this new environment, we're the thing that's being sold. It is our precious attention that is sought 24/7 and directed at content, whether it's real, true, relevant, irrelevant. It doesn't matter to these platforms. As long as we look and click and swipe and
yeah,
stay on the platform, they can make money. That's different to the industry that you knew and grew up in that I know, where you went to advertisers and asked for money. You asked people to turn over their hard-earned money to receive a newspaper or a cable subscription. And you didn't have to monetize them every single second of the day. And I think that's where a lot of the harms come from. And I'd rather legislators look at the front end of the
Yeah.
problem is, why do these platforms, why do we allow the relentless commercialization of our attention, and fix that problem, and then some of the other stuff about the outputs will resolve itself. Because we had to pay for these platforms, we wouldn't be on there barfing out our opinions 24/7 to everybody,
Mhm.
and pretending that they actually care what we say. It's a really weird way to do business, and
Well,
yet.
and we had these debates, I mean, honestly, for years in front of the Senate committees and the House committees about the wrongheadedness of this approach, because what it did, it ended up kind of impacting the people who were trying to start their Substack or their podcast or whatever it was, and we couldn't see the forest for the trees, right? We were targeting this guy. Meanwhile, everybody else can go out and purvey porn or recruit illegal immigrants or sell drugs or do anything else. And, we're just looking at it the wrong way. You've referenced this a couple of times, and I wanted to come to it because you've written about it, about the attention economy, which is so dominating politics. Like, you're young, you have young kids, so you get that the attention span of a flea, but that now seems to have affected the whole world, right? And you see people like Trump, who, as long as he's in the spotlight, as long as the camera's focused on him, it's both his success and his, at some point, likely demise, right? When you have to be the center of attention 24/7, then you're vulnerable when the attention is not positive. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
and that's exactly right, Senator. In the attention economy, the true currency is just being spoken about. And we've had sayings like all publicity is good publicity, but it's
Yeah,
not really.
as long as they spell the name right, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
But in the attention economy, so people often forget that Donald Trump ran for president twice before, or proto ran in
Yeah,
1988,
sure.
1987, the end of 1987. He put some ads in the Washington Post, Boston Globe, New York Times, and he railed against how the United States was getting ripped off. Only then it wasn't China, it was Japan. Japan was going to come. They're
Right.
eating our lunch. Why are we giving them oil? We're getting ripped off. It's bad for workers. He lost because the mainstream media, and like, he went on Donahue and all the big programs of the day and tried to drum up support for him, but he didn't make it because the media binned him off as unserious, and his ideas were unserious. And the Republican Party said, yeah, no thanks. You have to do this, follow this rule, build this support, get that. And he didn't want to do the hard work
Yeah.
of building a ground swell behind him. He tried again in 2000, same story, and then he went away for a decade and licked his wounds and became one of the world's biggest television stars, because the reality TV was the kind of proto version
Yeah,
of the
the new
internet,
thing.
where it was, you could just be this outrageous character, and like, we all rubberneck the car crash, right? We all look at that weird thing and go, ooh, what's that? And that's Donald Trump. And then in 2012, he gets on Twitter, or 2009, he gets on Twitter, and he figures out quickly, I never get challenged about what I say here, or if I am, I could ignore it and just keep talking and nobody can shut me up. And so I'll start talking about Barack Obama not being a real American, being born abroad. I'll get made fun of, chapter and verse. Doesn't matter to me. I'll keep going. And he's now the man without shame, has met this information economy without shame. And that's his superpower. You or I would
Mhm.
feel ridiculous going out and saying the things he said, because we're
Yeah,
decent
but
people
it's
that are governed by
unbelievably
shame.
successful. I mean, this is 6 months in, and he's accomplished incredible things. You might disagree with them, but the accomplishment list is unreal.
Yeah, and more to the point, we can't focus on anything long enough to
Right,
really get
right.
outraged. Like, even today, he's out there saying things about immigrants being better at farming because their backs are built for it and stuff. Like, that used to end your career, right? Because there
Yeah,
wasn't this tidal wave of stuff coming the next day to knock it off the news cycle. We sat and chewed on things for longer. There were fewer platforms that more people watched. You could, if something led the news on CTV at night, that was a
yeah,
problem for a
yeah,
government. You needed to get that off the front. Now there's a thousand other things that come the next day and just wipe it away. And even if you're the source of the next outrage, at least they're not talking about yesterday's outrage, or
yeah.
even this morning's outrage, or even this front half of the hour is outrage.
Well, it does seem to be a superpower because we all preface all of our discussions as you and I did today, which is okay, here's the state of play this minute, but by the time our conversation is over, it could have changed because he might have announced something else. On the other hand, he used this world we're in, not only the technology but the attention economy that it's created to give voice to a whole lot of people who felt unheard. And that too was powerful. Nobody would have believed that he would get a second crack at this.
Yeah, and look, like, be careful what you wish for, right? You see with the Epstein thing, like these people he gave a voice to believe a
Hmm.
lot of weird things, right? And
Yeah.
I think people forget that the head of the FBI and the deputy head of the FBI are like bona fide conspiracy theorists. And
Well,
they're the
some of
ones.
it's true. That's the problem.
I mean, yeah, look, as ever, there's a grain of truth in all
Yeah,
this
yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
But when your constituency, and this is the real harmful
Yeah.
thing that we'll get at the end of Trump, is a lot of people have been let down for a very long time by their politicians, people who told them, what turned out to be the lie about globalization, that the tide lifts all boats. It doesn't lift all boats. It lifts some, hurts others. We didn't do enough to help the people that were left behind. Financial crisis, all the rich people got bailed out. Your cost of living went up. And then the pandemic, same thing happened. So you have these people that, are let down and might have even been let down by Trump version one. But Joe Biden basically spent a few years just telling them everything was great
Yeah.
on the cost of living when it wasn't. And I think people feel gaslit with their politicians who live a very different life to them, going, you're fine, just be quiet. And Trump gives them voice, but he
Yeah.
doesn't. I don't think he doesn't fix the problem. And that's where I worry. What happens when he fails them? Yeah, he'll blame everybody. It's not his fault.
Well, and he may not fail them on those larger questions. As you say, he may end up being most vulnerable to something like Epstein, which he may or may not have any culpability in, right? But that may be what takes him down because of this call for transparency on the part of the people who are his mega base.
Yeah, it could be, but I think, Senator, I still trend to the view that pocketbooks are still the thing. And
Yeah.
I think if
No,
you
I
look
agree.
at tariffs, the revenue, he's boasting about the revenue as tariffs. So like that's the tax your people are paying. And I think companies had enough leeway or runway to get product into the country before they came into force. They're not passing the cost on yet because they want to see if things change. But if this is going to be the new reality, those costs will start filtering through, and they'll filter through on the people that can least afford to have
Hmm.
those increased costs. And that, I think, the midterms, I think, is the next point that everybody's looking at, going, if they bite ahead of that, Donald Trump and the down
Yeah.
ballot Republicans will have a really hard time going, look, I cut your Medicaid. I put a whole bunch of money in the rich people's pocket. I told you I was doing it for you. Sorry. And of course, Trump, he'll bluster his way. No, everything's perfect. Like, he just fired the head of the data statistics
Yeah. Yeah.
bureau that gave him a jobs report he didn't want. The man doesn't care. He's not being held accountable.
The
The media can't do it anymore. We're
yeah.
in the bad place.
Heading toward the midterms says that's a test. I mean, there's the also the other side of this, which is because he is paying down debt, even though that was not supposed to be the motivation for this, and funding programs, all of that stuff is non-inflationary. So he actually gets some benefit from that. He gets some credibility on the economic stuff if the timing is right for him heading into the midterms.
Yeah, and that's, look, he's larded on another few trillion dollars
Yeah,
in debt. But yeah, it is a question of when that hits the pocketbook. And I
yeah.
think that's the race we're in. I think you're right. That's the race we're in, is will it hit before he
Yeah,
has to go to the ballot? And then, quite frankly, he could care less at the end of his term, because JD Vance, he's kind of said, well, at least today, that he'll probably be the
at least today.
candidate
That's
on
true.
the ballot.
Yeah,
That'll
yeah.
change tomorrow. And yeah, I just wish we lived in a world where these kind of self-obsessed me monkeys weren't the kings of everything. And like, if you think about somebody like Stephen Harper, that is not a man that ever sought attention or wanted to be the center of attention. He just wanted to sit down behind a big desk, get all the problems and work through them and say, this is what I think we
Do
need to
the
do. This
math.
is what I think I need to do. This is what I think I need to do. That not be the circus. I want to not be the circus anymore.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of
He
people are
was,
not.
I was at this conference in Saskatoon last week where he spoke, and it was one of those, kind of more informal chats and in a room. He was a little bit more personal than you usually see Stephen Harper talking about that perhaps when he first came to office, and you were there, you were around for all of this, that he was not really psychologically prepared. I think his phrase was he didn't have the right character qualities for the job at the time, and so he had to adjust, and that he was too impatient, not realizing that humans are humans and there's frailty. This is not generally how Stephen Harper carries on a conversation. It's usually about the inflation rate and the economics and all of that. What'd you make of that?
Yeah, look, this, as well, that this was always the cry from people.
Yeah.
We would do things like have the journalists around at 24 Sussex at Christmas for a few drinks and, oh my God, he's really funny and personable. He can tell a story and he just didn't feel himself to be the public performer. But I think it's a good thing in life when the older you get, the more
Yeah.
wisdom you get. And, everybody's young and headstrong and sure that they know everything. And I think the real strength of character is when you look back and go, I wasn't right about that. Or, if you don't go on that journey, then I'm worried about you. And I
Yeah.
think,
I agree.
I was surprised to hear him say that the memoirs would be coming, even though, at the end of
Mhm.
every day, no matter how long the day was, if we were flying home from an event in Saskatchewan back to Ottawa, he would go through his notes from the Privy Council office and all the policy stuff. But at the end of the day, he'd mark up his agenda with his thoughts and reminiscences about who he met and what the outcome
Wow.
was and what is. So it's all there. And I think it was a difficult and important time. And I think getting back to your original point, in 2006, Stephen Harper, 125, 26 seats. I can't remember the exact. It's a nothing minority, right? Everybody expected to be a cup of coffee, another election,
Yeah.
and maybe that's the end of Stephen Harper. And then something happened in the form of well, the Bloc, NDP, and Liberals
Yeah.
trying to get up, and then the financial crisis, right? That was the issue where Stephen Harper, the intellect, economist, temperament, met the moment of people being genuinely fearful about what was going to happen to the country, and him having the wherewithal and the flexibility in the policy to do things like we were talking about on the auto industry, but putting the deficit up to, I remember I had to brief out the line of what the deficit was going to be in that budget. And even I dropped
Yeah.
whoa, what's that number? And I think, he showed through government, and this isn't what the public's perception was, that he would adapt. He wasn't militant. He wasn't the ideologue. He put water in his wine.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're seeing now with this conversation is he's hugely experienced. I think it would be great if we could find some way to tap that experience as a country
Well, the
because
Carney government called him, apparently, as he shared with everybody in the room to ask him about trade. And surprisingly, he said, toughen up, think about diversity. This may not be, which I was kind of surprised to hear from him.
yeah, and that, and I think he even said this, but I remember that Canada has no better friend than the States was our
Right.
line. And whether that was Obama, in geopolitical stuff, saying, look, if you lead, we'll be right behind you because we know that you lead, we follow, we buttress, we strengthen, happy to do that. And I think, and in government, look, the Harper government did trade with the EU, got that
Yeah.
done, got into
Yeah.
the Trans-Pacific Partnership, tried to build Kitimat and get stuff to tie. Like it's not that the government didn't know that these things had to happen. It's just that they can't happen on a dime. And yeah, I think it's a sad day when you as a Canadian have to realize that your best friend is now like at best unreliable, at worst actively
Well,
hostile.
and that we have let ourselves become so dependent and so vulnerable. Like if you only do business with one person, when that person gets sick, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and then look, I've used this analogy before, saying it's almost like a marriage where you
Yeah.
decide not to work, and then
Yeah.
then your spouse at the end of a long and successful partnership kind of bins you off and says, "Now go make your way in the world."
Yeah.
And you might have been doing all the things for the right reasons, supporting the family, raising the kids, and all that stuff, but that doesn't change the fact that you were dependent. And
Yeah.
that's the social
Yeah.
contract, right? And Canada and the US have managed that dance better than any two nations for longer than just about any two nations. And I guess this is what the Stoics say, that it's the unexpected blow that lands the heaviest. And I think that's what Canada's
Yeah.
experienced now. You never
Yeah.
contemplate this thing. And imagine if you had gone to your Senate colleagues and said, look, I think we need to dedicate a lot of time and thinking to what happens if the United States goes rogue.
Yeah.
Your colleagues would have been like 10 years ago and like, oh, Senator Wallen, what do you, come on.
Yeah.
Surely there's more important things, right? And I think I mean, hindsight's 2020, isn't it? But
Yeah.
it doesn't change the fact that we are where we are now, and we ought to do everything we can to strengthen Canada, and diversify, knock down interprovincial trade barriers, get
Yeah.
those
All of
major
that.
projects done. Bin off supply management. Like, I could list a few things that Canada
Yeah.
ought to do anyway that would help in the.
That's what I mean. A lot of this we need to do for our own sake. It's not about appeasing Donald Trump. It's about us taking charge of our own. So, look, are you going to stay in London forever? Why are you there? Why did you move there?
Well, my mom's from Ealing, from West
Oh,
London.
okay.
So I come by it honestly. And now I have two
Okay.
beautiful girls, and they were born here and raised here. I have a business here. So yeah, I'm here. This is home. This
Wow,
is
that's great.
Yeah, no, look, and look, I still write about Canada because I like to keep my toe in the water, and it's my way of keeping in touch with what goes on, because obviously, like, it will always be my home, and what matters there matters to me, and what happens there, sorry, matters to me. And
Yeah,
I want Canada to succeed. And the older I get, the less partisan I get. And
right.
it's not
Exactly.
about, like, everybody is in public life, and you'll know this speaking to your colleagues in the Senate. They want to help. They want to make a difference. That and we got to find ways to help people have those conversations that can make a difference, where it's not giving in to the other side, where it's not being weak. We all benefit from everyone's collective experience, and some people get to call the shots for a period of
Yeah.
time, but then the other side has to come in and
And then that
build on what
changes.
comes before.
It's absolutely true. Great talking with you, Andrew, and thanks for giving us a little bit of a perspective from the other side. We do become, quite, it's part of the issue we're talking about. We're sort of very myopic and north-south focused, and then when that changes, we have to look around and start to understand the other parts of the world that we haven't been looking at that closely. So it was really good to get your take today. Thanks.
Well, thank you for lending me your platform. Hopefully I don't with anything I say in this
Oh, I don't
attention.
know. We'll be shut down. I'm sure we're going to be censored for something. The new British unit for internet intelligence may be coming to get us. I don't know. We didn't even get to that. We'll do that another time. Andrew MacDougall used to be the director of communications for Prime Minister Harper, but now a partner at Trafalgar Communications. It's a consulting firm, and as he said, kids and family and mother, and so now he has kind of a new home, but he hasn't forgotten the old one. So thanks so much, and we'll talk again soon, Andrew, I'm sure. And thanks to everybody who joined us today and listened in on our conversation. It was a good one. We'll see you again soon for another edition of No Nonsense.